Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about pediatrics and pediatric drug development as it's defined by the RESI in early stage investment. So the topic of my presentation today is pediatric drug development, current industry regulatory perspectives, and emerging issues, a pediatric practical approach. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Paidion Research. We are a dedicated pediatric organization, a clinical research organization that only does pediatric drug development work with pharmaceutical industry. The children that you see here are just an example of some of the ones that we work with over the years, and we will be exploring some of the new practical approaches to and the regulatory perspective as it applies to the drug development industry. Paidion is a Greek word meaning a young child or young children. It is pronounced Paidion. This patient population here, the special pediatric population, is one that has been basically orphaned for so long that children of this age group, this is a 750 gram, 28-week gestation baby that I happen to be involved in and taking care of back in the late 80s. This child, if you can do clinical research here in this patient population, you certainly can do research in all the other age groups of children that we see and perform drug development in each day. This child represents a child that where back in the late 80s and early 90s, a pulmonary surfactant would have been very helpful for this child. Unfortunately, this child was born long before pulmonary surfactants became available in 1991. But this child does exemplify and represent the patient population that's most critical need and is the one that we focus on in our organization in the NICU, neonatal intensive care unit, and PICU, pediatric intensive care unit space. As we go through this presentation today, you'll learn a little bit about some of the aspects of the care of this child, and also you'll learn more about the regulatory climate that surrounds drug development in this patient population, as well as all the older populations that we deal with. In the regulatory climate, the FDA came out with all the regulations in 1997, and we'll go through those. But the age groups that we're dealing with are everything from a 22-week gestation baby up to less than 18 years of age. And if you break that down to the various cohorts, the adolescent population is 12 to 17 years of age. The pediatric population is 6 to 11. And then the next age group down is the child, which is 2 to 5. And then any child below 2 to 0 are infants. And then before 0 is a preterm neonatal patient. So the objectives of today's presentation are to outline the past and current pediatric regulatory framework. This is important because this is a cost driver for many of the pharmaceutical companies out there that are not only developing drugs for children, but are developing drugs for the adult population. The current regulation states that if you develop a drug for an adult, you have to study that compound in children. The second objective that I want to talk about is to review the economic return on investment for pediatric exclusivity. This is something that's kind of near and dear to my heart because we actually did this while I was at Duke University working with the FDA. The third objective is to define the statute of the orphan drug program. The fourth is to explain the misconception in the orphan drug legislation, and we'll go through that in a moment, and explain the economic benefits of receiving priority review and rare pediatric designation. This is a key economic driver in the rare space because there are 7,000 rare diseases. 3,500 of those rare diseases affect children, and so that this is a big economic return if you can get a pediatric rare disease designation. And then lastly, we're going to list the penalties for not performing your pediatric studies in the United States and in Europe. So where have we been collectively as a profession in drug development? Well, we have been building a regulatory story for both the FDA and EMA, the Food and Drug Administration, and the European Medicine Agency. This regulatory story started in 1994 at the FDA and then migrated to 2006 by the EMA. Defining the pediatric patient population is another place that we've been. We've spent a lot of time defining what a child is, what ages, and I've already given those ages to you: 12 to 17, 6 to 11, 2 to 5, 0 to 2, and then less than 0 for the neonatal patient population. But we've also defined not only the age, but the weight of the child, the ethnicity, the race. All of these parameters are addressed in any pediatric study plan or pediatric drug plan. And we've been deciding if we need formulation development. And so there's been many arguments around formulation development, but most recently, as of 2007, we've been studying things like palatability and how much that costs to develop a CMC section of a drug that's only available in a tablet formulation or maybe a capsule formulation for the adult population, but now has to be scaled down or at least put into a dosage form that can be easily consumed by the child. One of the worst things that we could do is develop a tablet formulation, try to over-encapsulate that tablet into a capsule and give it to a 6-year-old child. That will not work. Many 6-year-old children cannot swallow a tablet of that size, and the size that I'm talking about is a number one capsule. A number one capsule is the size of a prenatal vitamin. So you can imagine that a 6-year-old would have a difficult time swallowing that. Believe it or not, many companies think that that's the way we can get drugs to this patient population. Pediatrics is by over-encapsulating a tablet. It will not work. You have to reformulate the drug into the age group in which it was designed for. And if it happens to be a 0 to 2-year age population, this will probably be a liquid dosage form or a granule, or now what's called a stick, where you can pour that stick granules into some liquid, whether it's water or other liquid, preferably water, dissolve it and give it down an NG tube, a nasogastric tube, or give it to the child. Now, one of the premises in clinical pharmacology is that if we can't get the drug to the site of activity, it won't work. Well, if you can't get the drug in the child, it won't get to the site of activity. So one of the things I've put on this slide is palatability. And palatability is a mandate by the FDA and the EMA for all drugs for formulation in children, younger age groups than 12 years of age. So palatability is defined as the look, the feel, the smell, and the taste of a drug. So it's all of these in combination to make sure that the drug is palatable for the child and that child then can take the medication. So continuing on with this theme of where have we been, we've been developing internal pediatric expertise to handle the mandate for pediatric studies. Pharma, academia are developing new skill sets and personnel, and this is true because back in the early 2000s, late 1999, many pharmaceutical companies had no idea that they were going to be developing drugs for children. So hence, whoever was a physician in a pharmaceutical company became the de facto pediatric expert, and that just did not work out very well. So over time, what we've been able to do is develop personnel in the pharmaceutical industry and academia to guide the new skill sets that were needed. One of the largest pharmaceutical companies to do this was Novartis. Novartis probably has one of the greatest group of people doing pediatric drug development, and they're dedicated to this within their company. Pfizer, J&J, Shire, which now is owned by Takeda, all of these companies have the capability and the expertise now internal to help better design trials and then to outsource them for execution into the CRO industry. Another aspect of where we've been is creating internal regulatory expertise for pediatric patients within the agencies, whether it's the EMA or FDA. The EMA created these internal regulatory experts some time ago, as well as the FDA. The FDA started in 1997 under the guidance of the BPCA, the Best Pharmaceuticals Children's Act of 1997, which was signed into law by Bill Clinton. Later on came another legislative initiative called PREA, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, and that too required the pharmaceutical industry to develop drugs, even down to the neonatal patient population. In 2012, under the Obama administration, they signed into law FDASIA. FDASIA mandated that the FDA put a neonatologist on their pediatric committee. The Pediatric Therapeutic Committee within the FDA has now a neonatologist, since many of the drugs that we'll be developing go down to the neonatal patient population. The FDA and the EMA have monthly teleconferences now to discuss the pediatric programs. You can only imagine back in the early 2000s, all the way up to 2007, when the FDA would mandate a clinical trial or a series of clinical trials in children. The EMA would then mandate their clinical trials in children. And if you're a global pharmaceutical company, you became very disenchanted with the fact that you were doing two different development programs for pediatrics. And of course, this is very expensive and costly to the pharmaceutical industry. And so around 2007, the FDA and the EMA began to have monthly teleconferences to discuss the various pediatric programs that were being engaged, whether it was a PSP, a pediatric study plan for the FDA, or a PIP, pediatric investigational plan for the EMA. This slide represents the regulatory paths for both US and EU. And if we look at this slide carefully, what we see are two distinct changes in the legislation. One of those changes is that in the United States, we have to file our pediatric study plan after 60 days after the end of phase 2 meeting for any compound. Then once you've got into phase 2 and you've got your initial pediatric study plan outlined, you will agree to do a set of studies under the Pediatric Research Equity Act, which is a contract basically with the FDA and the pharmaceutical company. Along this line also is you can ask for and request for a BPCA written request, and that written request will give you the opportunity to get exclusivity at the end of your studies, which the exclusivity would be 6 months of market exclusivity tacked onto the back of your patent, which can be quite informative, and we'll discuss this later in the presentation, but also it can be very cost effective or costly, depending upon when and how you do this. But in the FDA, one of the things we've learned, and most people do file their PSP or pediatric study plans after phase 2, but yet they don't engage the studies till well after phase 3 in the pediatric patient population. So you're developing a drug for adults, you have to develop it for children, you're going to file your plan after phase 2, and actually most companies now will not start their studies until after phase 3, and that will trigger something called a post-marketing requirement. Many of the pharmaceutical companies actually push the pediatric plans off until they get the adult approval in the United States, and then they agree to a post-marketing requirement. The post-marketing requirement actually is another contract with the agency saying that we will file on an annual report each year on the progress of our pediatric plan. And if you don't execute on that pediatric plan, there's a penalty associated with that. And we'll get into the penalty clause in a few minutes. In Europe, it's a little bit different. The EMA actually passed their legislation in 2006. And what that legislation said was that you have to file and get an approval or an PIP, an initial pediatric investigational plan, that has to begin after phase 1 of your adult trials. Well, that's great, but you don't have a lot of data. You have very little safety data. You have some PK data after phase 1, but you don't have any safety and efficacy data other than in the adult population. This became a sticking point in the European space. However, this is what the rules and the guidelines say, is that you have to file your PIP after phase 1 in the adults. From that point forward, you get an approved PIP, but you have to have an approved PIP before you get your market authorization in Europe, unlike the United States. In Europe, especially in the EMA, if you don't get an approved PIP, you will not be given the opportunity to go forward with your market authorization of your adult indication. This is one of the penalties that the Europeans waited 9 years to watch the US legislation, and then they filled that gap with this mandatory pediatric investigational plan requirement. So after phase 3, you should have your approved PIP, and then you can move forward with your market authorization in the adult arena. In Europe, you don't have a PMR space, and you don't need one because you're guaranteeing that you're going to do your trials when you get your adult indication. So let's look at the European regulation position. This is a timeline for your PIP, your Pediatric Investigational Plan. This slide was prepared by Ernest Kopecky some time ago, but what it outlines for you is a very simple way in a complicated trial process with dealing with the European Medicine Agency. European Medicine Agency's review group is called PEDCO, Pediatric Drug Committee, and that Pediatric Drug Committee is constituted of a variety of different people, depending upon which division you happen to be placed in. If you're in pulmonology, you get a pulmonary PEDCO group, and that PEDCO group usually is represented by 3 rapporteurs. Of those 3 rapporteurs or reviewers, those individuals will have to come to equipoise on your PIP to be able to move it forward and give it approval. You can see here the time clock, and the time clock on a PIP is much longer and more complicated than a PSP in some instances, and it can be up to at least 120 days in total length. And you can have stops in the PIP process. You have waits in the PIP process. One of the things I would encourage everyone who is either funding or looking at funding a pharmaceutical company, whether it's a biotech or small pharma company, and I would encourage you to look carefully at what has been agreed to by the PEDCO or by the FDA. These things are extremely expensive to carry forward and can result in all sorts of penalties and stops along the way. So where are we collectively going in the pediatric drug development space? Well, one of the places we're going is increasing in pediatric requirements for FDA and EMA. And we've seen that, and we've seen it already. We've seen it from the very beginning in 1994 with the first pediatric rule, and now in 2006 with the Europeans, and then 2012 with FDASIA. The age categories for study will move to the neonatal patient population, and we're seeing a large number of studies now coming to bear in the pediatric neonatal arena. These are not only for neonatal diseases that occur in neonatology, but it's also for other diseases that we would see. For instance, one example would be, you might say, well, Viagra will never be developed for children, specifically for an erectile dysfunction disease. And the answer is, and that's not true, because Viagra is a pulmonary vasodilator and actually is a drug that can work in pulmonary arterial hypertension in the newborn. And so Pfizer, who developed Viagra, actually had 6 clinical trials in the space ongoing at any given time during the life of the program, both for approval in the FDA and the EMA. I want to stop here and say that one of the main reasons why we are doing this pediatric drug development is that we want to get or want to gain knowledge about the correct dose, dosing interval, and safety profile and efficacy of any drug that's in the marketplace. To do that, you have to do a series of trials in that age group. And in each age group may be a little different than the next age group. So you can't just allometrically scale from an adult down to, let's say, a 2-year-old, because even though a 2-year-old is small, they're not a small adult. And so these children are ever evolving. So their central compartment where drugs would be metabolized or excreted would be changing always. So if you're dealing with a neonatal patient population, one of the things that you'd be concerned about is that they're rapidly changing. Their organ systems are rapidly changing and metabolizing or excreting drugs. And so one of the things you look at is a central compartment of the drug, the liver, lung, brain, kidney, heart, gut. Those spaces, which is called a central compartment, are always ever evolving. And so that's the reason why we want to determine the safety profile in that space. We want to determine the dose and the dosing interval, and then certainly if the drug is efficacious in that patient population. Now, one of the things that where we're going is that orphan drug designation will drive the birth of new pharmaceutical companies within the pharmaceutical industry. This is very vital because what orphan drug designation gives a pharmaceutical company is 7 years of exclusivity. Well, there's some issues with that, and we'll get into that in a little bit, as specifically as applies to pediatrics. Continuing with this theme, the new pharmaceutical company expertise will be emerging, both orphan disease groups and pediatric pharmacometrics. So as I mentioned earlier, in the pharmacometric space, we're learning about the younger age population, specifically as we do modeling and simulation into this space. We're ever evolving into different models to look at how drugs behave in the younger and more vulnerable patient population. The regulatory framework to address unmet medical needs and rare diseases will be much more active as we go forward in drug development. Dedicated pediatric research organizations will emerge to handle the volume of pediatric trials. What we see now is we see large CROs having pediatric groups, but they're not focused on just children. We'll see other organizations that will be dedicated only to the development of children, and there'll be plenty of work in that space to do this. The last would be that we see site networks that will be formed to execute new paradigms in recruiting patients globally. Many diseases, especially in the rare and ultra-rare space, will require more of a global footprint, if you will, to the actual execution of the trial. This is a challenging place to be, one of which we see lots of promise for new drugs in the rare disease space and for the treatment of these children. We'll see organizations like Sturge-Weber Foundation, we'll see Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, we'll see all of these organizations coming together to aid in the site network formation in this space. These are important topics because without enrollment, we can't really get to a treatment or a cure for disease. Currently, our group is working on a special disease state called hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, and it's an amazing compound and will have an amazing result, I believe. But we're yet to determine that because we're just now into the single ascending dose study in the neonatal patient population with this intravenous formulation. So what have we accomplished in the globalization of the pediatric effort? Well, in the United States, as I've already indicated and hinted at, in 1994, we had the first pediatric rule. In 1997, we had the Food Modernization Act, the FDA Modernization Act, founded and signed into law by Bill Clinton. And in 1998, we had the pediatric rule, which was later stricken down and was replaced by the Pediatric Research Equity Act of 2003. In the midst of all that, we have BPCA, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act of 2002, which gave exclusivity to the pharmaceutical companies for doing the pediatric work. And now in 2012, we have FDASIA. FDASIA is an all-encompassing legislation, and we'll get a little bit more detailed in later slides. But one of the things about FDASIA, which is very important to understand, is that this is a law that was passed by President Obama, and it cannot be repealed. It's, as opposed to in the previous years under the Food and Drug Modernization Act of '97, every 5 years the legislation had to be brought before Congress and reauthorized. And in 2006 and 2007, you're hearing in subsequent slides, is that this piece of legislation was in jeopardy of not being reauthorized. But now, after 2012, there is no revolving reauthorization of the pediatric studies or pediatric regulatory climate. In Europe, the EMA, or European Union, excuse me, created their pediatric legislation on June 1, 2006, after watching and observing the United States for a long period of time, 9 years. They actually came out with a very nice piece of legislation which mandated pediatric research forever, just very similar to FDASIA, but with more penalties associated with that. So let's talk a little bit about the economic return for exclusivity. This has been a real question in a lot of people's minds, specifically in 2006, when the legislation was being thought about to be reauthorized, and it was coming down to 1 or 2 votes in Congress to reauthorize BPCA and PREA. And so was there any precise data that was available, or had there been any data that could be collected in this space? Was there any previous published data then all the published data varied greatly about what it costs to do the economic return on exclusivity. So if you were to get 6 months market exclusivity, what would it cost you to get that exclusivity to apply it to the end of your patent life of the compound? For instance, one of the compounds that was being touted as being out of scope, if you will, or out on the fringes was Lipitor. Lipitor in 2006 was selling for about $14 billion a year. And if you got 6 months market exclusivity, you would receive an upside of about $7 billion to do your pediatric exclusivity. Would you do a pediatric exclusivity that costs you $20 million to get a $7 billion return? Absolutely. But that's not the case for all drugs, and we're going to see that in a few moments. The FDA also lacked expertise and manpower to ferret out the economic return for exclusivity. There's no way that they had enough resources to be able to do this, not only from a publication and mining of the BPCA exclusivity data and PREA data. They were outmanned and outgunned. They just could not do that. And so one of the critical questions of the impact remained: was exclusivity worth it? And what was the return on investment? Well, in 2005, the FDA came to Duke University, and I was part of this, and they established the public-private partnership between Duke University and the FDA. And that goal of that partnership was to create an unbiased academic partner that could look at the FDA's exclusivity data, tell the FDA what it cost, and then through a variety of different mechanisms, we were able to get some very exclusive third-party pricing data for most of the compounds that we were studying. I'd say all the ones we studied, actually, and we put those into a model and looked at that. And then the last thing we were doing, we'd have to disseminate the analysis of all this information and publish in a manuscript, which would then be published to the general public. So the objective of this publication was to quantify the economic return to the industry for successfully completing the clinical trials for pediatric exclusivity. And we did. And here's the publication which we published. It was called The Economic Return of Clinical Trials Performed under the Pediatric Exclusivity Program. It was published February 7th, 2007. And the real hallmark behind this publication was not only to say how much it costs to do pediatric exclusivity. And I'll tell you that it costs about, on average, about $12.5 million in 2006, 2005, 2006 to do exclusivity here in the United States. That was a shocking number in a way, because it wasn't a high number, it wasn't a very low number, but many of the companies that were studied and published in this paper, many of the compounds never reaped the benefit of the exclusivity. However, there were many that did, and there's some charts and graphics in this paper to look at. I won't belabor that today, but I will tell you that we now know how much it costs to do exclusivity, and we published a number of papers in this space. So what's the latest U.S. regulatory climate? What does that look like? Well, we've already talked a little bit about FDASIA of 2012 and when Obama signed this into to law, but who must submit an initial PSP? When should you initiate a PSP? We've talked a little bit about that after phase 2, but that's not always the case, and it always wanders off to after phase 3 and even after drug approval. What should be included in your initial PSP? What should be included in the request amendment to agreed upon PSPs? And can you get a waiver of these things? Can you get a waiver for a certain age group? And the answer is yes, you can, but there are very few waivers for a whole program in pediatrics. As a matter of fact, I think there's only 2 that have been given throughout the history of since 1997 until today for a complete waiver of a program. And lastly, what does a template look like for submitting a PSP? Well, under FDASIA, one of the rules that FDASIA did, and I've stated this before, is it made permanent the BPCA, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act, and the Pediatric Research Equity Act of 2002. All of this now is permanent. It's not going to be repealed, can't be repealed, and it will go forward in perpetuity. So one of the other pieces that the FDASIA provided was the pediatric formulation development. Why did we need pediatric formulation development? Well, many compounds that were studied, specifically the pediatric antihypertensives under BPCA and PREA, never showed any efficacy in those trials. And so we could not quite figure out why these drugs who worked quite well in the adult population had very little efficacy in the pediatric space. And the rationale was that we were not doing weight-based dosing, and also the pediatric formulations were not available for the age groups that we needed to study. So now we will have age-appropriate formulations for all pediatric groups, including neonates. And so this is a big ticket item price-wise for a pharmaceutical company. So instead of having a $12.5 million development of a compound for exclusivity, you will now be mandated to develop an age-specific formulation and have palatability associated with that. We currently, in our organization, are doing a palatability study as we speak on a new anti-epileptic compound that will be forthcoming. So what else was embedded in the FDASIA legislation? Well, it stated that the sponsor had 60 days post the EOP phase 2 meeting to initiate or provide the FDA with your pediatric study plan. And that's an important time clock, but as you've seen already and you've heard already, that clock moves down the road, and you have to report on that clock every year. There is a time span. You can't push the pediatric program off for 10 or 15 or 20 years. You have a time clock that is reasonable and agreed upon by the FDA after your EOP2 meeting. And then lastly, the FDA was required by Congress under FDASIA, the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, OPT, was required to have a neonatologist on staff because of the neonatal trials that would be coming and being requested by the FDA. So again, timings, 60 days after the end of phase 2 meeting, you have to file your IPFP, and you have to get it approved in that time span. This is the summary of the planned non-clinical and clinical studies that you might see in the guidance document for under FIDASIA, and it addresses anything from um, you need studies that are in a certain species, rat, dog, cat. You need juvenile studies. If you're going below 2 years of age and you have to develop the drug for that, you will have to have GB tox data. Again, another expensive adventure into the drug development space. Planned pediatric clinical studies are all laid out by age group, type of study, and any kind of deferral that you might want to ask for in this template. And I say ask for because you may not get them. And then you have to look at the clinical effectiveness and safety studies that are associated with these age groups. And that may be as much as a phase 1B, a phase 2, proof of concept, and then ultimately a phase 3 efficacy trial for approval in pediatrics. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the pediatric or rare pediatric disease designation and something that has been in effect called the Priority Review Voucher Program here in the United States. This voucher was originally designated to create an incentive, if you will, to study rare diseases in children. And as a part of that, you would get a priority review voucher. Well, what does a priority review voucher do for you? This is a real economic boost in the arm of any pharmaceutical company, especially small biotech and small pharma companies. So to define a rare pediatric disease, this is a disease that is serious and life-threatening disease. It manifests primarily, affects individuals ages below 18 years of age down to the neonatal patient population. And in 2016, this legislation expired, but it was reauthorized under the Advanced Hope Act. And so now we have this going forward, and we'll talk about the time clock on this in a moment. But this must be studied in a rare disease is any disease that is less than 200,000 persons in the United States or fewer. As of those 3,500 rare diseases that I indicated that are out there, such as Pompe, Duchenne's, muscular dystrophy, Gaucher's, Pompe, all of these diseases are rare diseases. Even sickle cell anemia is a rare disease here in the United States. Those all qualify for rare pediatric disease designation. And the other thing is it does not seek approval. You cannot seek approval for the adult indication in the original rare pediatric disease product application. You have to seek that in other, such as orphan drug space. The rare pediatric disease designation may require or request a rare pediatric disease designation different than the orphan designation. And these all reviewed by the Office of Orphan Drug and the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, OPT. So these two review divisions within the FDA will give you either yes or no on your rare pediatric disease designation. And it's designed for drugs for the rare pediatric space and production of those products. Let me give you a little history of the rare pediatric disease and of the Priority Review Voucher Program. This was set to expire, the rare pediatric or the Priority Review Voucher was set to expire in September 30, 2016. But the 21st Century Cure Act extended the Rare Pediatric Disease PRV program, this review voucher. Now, the interesting thing about this voucher program is that this voucher can be sought for by small biotech or small pharma, and then that voucher can then be redeemed or sold in the open market space to another organization, whether it's private, public, and that sell process would allow the buyer of the PRV to be able to redeem that at their will for an adult indication, buying them 6 months extension on the front end of their application. In other words, they can get approval of their adult product by having in hand a priority review voucher that they purchased from a small biotech. This is extremely important with the small biotech space. We'll see this in a moment in another slide, because the PRV, the priority review voucher, is something that is almost like having your own built-in internal venture capital group if you were to obtain one and get it and be designated as a rare pediatric disease. The no voucher awards were after September 30th, 2020. So at the end of this month, in September of 2020, this PRV piece of legislation will go away. And we are hoping that it will be reauthorized by Congress before this happens, but there's no certainty of this. There are a number of companies who've been awarded a PRV, and there are a number of companies who are trying to make this deadline of September 30, 2020. There are 4 or 5 in the last month or so that have gotten that, but the drug must be approved to get your PRV. The drug must be approved even if you got the rare pediatric disease designation and a PRV. The drug must be approved by September 30, 2022. Okay, so what's some current data on the PRVs? Well, there are 20 vouchers have been awarded as of 6/1/2020. 7 of those have been redeemed for priority review. 7 rare pediatric voucher requests have been denied as of 2018. And the reasons for that are varied. You can read those here. They did not establish the age range that they were looking for. They didn't follow the proper statistical information. They did longitudinal data and did not provide actual clinical data for this PRV. Now, this slide kind of tells it all. This is the priority review voucher program as it applies for rare pediatric diseases. And what you see here is that in about 2014, 2015, we started to see an uptick in people with this piece of legislation, especially biotech. The largest award or sale of a PRV occurred in 2015, and that company was BioMarin. They sold this product. I can't remember exactly who they sold it to, but there was a cartel bidding for it, and they sold it for $350 million. That was a big ticket item for them. In 2016, there were 3 PRVs. 2017, there were 6. 2018, there were 7. And you can see all the way over to 2020. Currently, because of supply and demand, what you're seeing is that the PRV return for your investment is about $100 million for each PRV that's in play. So for a small biotech, $100 million is a lot of money. Okay, let's talk a little bit about missteps in the clinical development plan. Well, we have many companies who are filing for their IPSP, and they seek regulatory guidance, whether they're U.S. companies or international companies. They know they're going to get their drug, and they have gotten their drug approved for the adult indication, but now they're looking to get an IPSP and get it approved. These IPSPs usually take about 1 to 2 years to negotiate out the exact development path forward. And so when you're doing this, you want to make sure, and this is a key component here, you want to make sure that you file for when you file your IPSP and you get approval for your clinical development plan, that you ask for, at that time, you ask for your exclusivity provision. If you do not ask for your exclusivity provision, one of the things that will happen to you is that you will go back later and say, oh, I forgot to file my exclusivity provision. I want my extra 6 months of market exclusivity. And the FDA will say, fine, but your agreed upon PSP is now null and void, and we will actually have to go back and renegotiate the pediatric study plan, which would be much more time consumption and also more costly to do that. And the likelihood of you being able to do the same studies that were agreed upon before with the FDA is very unlikely. And we've had that happen recently with one of our customers, that they went to a large CRO. They gave them some information that was not appropriate. And as a result of that, their PSP was they either could accept their initial PSP and give up their exclusivity, or perform another PSP, which is more complicated than the first one, and get their exclusivity. We are yet to determine how they will move forward. The orphan drug designation, as I've indicated previously, excludes the sponsor from performing pediatric studies. This was never the intent of the orphan drug designation, but that's in fact what happens. And so when you file for orphan drug, you automatically, and you get orphan drug, you automatically get 7 years of exclusivity, but you don't have to perform any pediatric trials associated with that orphan drug. Well, that's not what was intended, as I said. And so now there's a plug to that orphan drug designation provision, and it will plug the loophole. And so the FDA does not expect to grant any additional pediatric subpopulation designations going forward. A new piece of a new guidance document came out on that about a year ago. So failure to include an agreed IPSP in a market application subject to the pediatric PRV may be grounds for refusal to file action. So the FDA basically is saying that if you don't agree and you do not file an IPSP, or you don't act upon your Pediatric Research Equity Act agreement, if you had a PSP, you then are setting yourself up for a refusal to file action. And so that refusal to file action will ultimately result in potentially misbranding your adult indication if you're a small pharmaceutical company or biotech. And that would not be a good place to be. Currently, the FDA's only teeth in their legislation is to create shame and blame, and they have that published on the FDA website that you have refused to or have not met your PREA commitment, but you can, under the PMR space, continue to do the work and then ultimately get your PREA, Pediatric Research Equity Act agreement completed and done. Now, one of the last statements I'll make here is that in the European space, an IPIP must include modeling and simulation. And this is a must, because that is something that is on their first page of their actual application for an IPIP or a pediatric investigational plan. And you must have this modeling and simulation. Modeling and simulation typically costs somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000 to do. And then once you've done this, you will simply go back and use that model and that simulation to validate it for the right dose and dosing interval for that patient population. But you still have to go and do your safety and efficacy studies associated with that compound in that age group that you're being studied. So what have we learned by all of this? Well, we've learned from every pediatric trial. Every pediatric trial, actually, we've learned a tremendous amount from, whether it affected the child's growth, whether it affected the disease state, or whether the toxicity was too great for any age group of patient. Pediatric drug development is complex. It is not easy. It is difficult, even in areas of common diseases, such as atopic dermatitis or any of the other spaces that we've been working of late, where you have multiple clinical trials that remain in question. We are treating different diseases sometimes in the same trial. So if we're dealing with a younger patient population that's continually to metabolize and evolve as a child will do, what you'll see is that that disease state may change over time. And so it's a very hard place to pin down for clinical drug development, but it can be done and it should be done. So pediatric drug development, yes, it is complex and difficult, but it is very, very feasible to do. Even in the 23, 24, 25-week gestation babies, these are very vital studies to be done in that patient population. And there's studies that are informative to the general practice community who are working daily to make these children's lives better. And we want to make sure that we give the right dose of drug and the right dosing interval drug, and look at the safety profile that we see with that, and ultimately look at the efficacy that's associated with the development of the compound. Rigor in design and execution is essential, but with reasonable goals. And so this is one of the places where I like to say that you need to go to the FDA early and often. If you go and communicate to the FDA and the EMA, one of the things that's very interesting and very vital is that they will give you information. They will give you consultation. They will help you with your design and tell you if you're going down the right path or not, or if you're looking for a specific biomarker. That is not a punitive place to be. If you have good science and you're willing to go and do that, you'll come out on the other end a much better study and an approvable drug. These pediatric plans must be done in partnership with industry, regulators, academic pediatricians, patients, and parents. I can't stress enough this comment, because without the parents and the patients in many of these instances, we would have very little drug development. And so what we're starting to see is we're seeing parents inculcated into the design of trials. We like to give this what we call the practical approach to doing pediatric drug development, is so that we can see what happens at the actual pediatrician site, what's happening at the parent site, and what's happening certainly with the patient or subject that we're going to be studying in that disease state. And we must learn from our failures. And believe me, we've had lots of failures. And a hypertensive space was a big failure that has now been corrected. But there's lots of other failures in the drug development of pediatrics. Fortunately, not in a very detrimental way, but not in a positive efficacy way. And we also recognize that we learn pediatric clinical trials will provide more, as we learn, pediatric clinical trials will provide more valuable and scientific valid results. And applying those results will result in a pediatric label within the adult labeling information for the FDA. So, as Miriam Wright Edelman says, if we don't stand up for children, then we don't stand for much. I'd like to end by saying that that child you saw in the first of the study, or first of this presentation, was this child. And now this child is some 33 years old now. Her mother was an executive for IBM. She stayed home on a leave of absence for a year to help her child grow and mature. And this is extremely vital in the care of any child. But even a 28-week, 750-gram infant can be very, very vital and very treatable in any disease state that we have. So with that, I'll stop, I'll close, and I thank you for your time, and I hope that this has been informative to you.